Nobody in Addison, Michigan expected the opening day of the legendary 127-yard sale to become humanity's first alien encounter. Every year, thousands of bargain hunters gathered where America's most famous yard sale begins, but this time, the first visitors weren't looking for bargains. They came from the stars. And what happened next would prove that Earth's greatest weapon was never in a missile silo. It was sitting in a folding chair with a mug of coffee and a sign that said everything must go. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's move forward into the morning. Addison, Michigan changed forever. The sun came up slow and orange over Addison, Michigan, the kind of morning that smelled like fried bacon, cut grass, and diesel fuel from the trucks already lining Route 127. This was the first Friday of August, and that meant one thing to everyone in Hillsdale County. The 127 corridor sale was open for business, and Addison always claimed the first mile of it. Folding tables stretched down both sides of the highway as far as the eye could reach. Lawn chairs sat empty, waiting for their owners to finish setting up. Somewhere a generator sputtered to life, and country music crackled out of an old radio balanced on a stack of plastic totes. This was 130 miles of Americana, born out of nothing more than folks wanting to clean out their garages and make a little cash doing it. Frank Holloway had been running the same corner booth for 11 years straight. He was 62 years old, built like a man who had spent his whole life fixing tractors, which he had. His booth was a graveyard of rural Michigan history, rusted farm tools, a box of Army surplus canteens, an old CB radio, a dead television the size of a washing machine. Frank liked to say that if it didn't sell this year, it would sell next year, because nothing in Addison ever really disappeared. It just waited for the right buyer. Beside him, his neighbor Dale Whitfield was setting up a table of power tools, chainsaws, and a pressure washer that still ran, though it screamed like a banshee when you pulled the cord. Dale was younger, maybe 40, a mechanic over at the co-op, and he had a running joke with Frank that between the two of them, they had enough spare parts to build a whole new town if this one ever burned down. 2 booths over, Sheriff Marcus Bell was not working. He was off duty, technically, wearing jeans and a faded Detroit Tigers cap, looking for a fishing reel he'd heard some fellow from Jonesville was selling. Sheriff Bell had grown up 3 streets from where he now stood, and every year he took the day off just to walk the sale with his coffee and pretend, for a few hours, that he wasn't the only law enforcement officer most of these people would ever need. By 7 in the morning, the road was already packed. Trucks with Ohio and Indiana plates rolled in slow, looking for parking. Families spread out blankets. Kids ran between tables, while their parents haggled over dollar signs written in Sharpie on masking tape. It was loud and messy and wonderfully ordinary, which was exactly why nobody noticed the sky changing color until it was already too late to look away. It started as a strange shimmer, high above the tree line, like heat rising off summer asphalt, but too smooth, too even. Frank noticed it first because he had nothing better to do than glance upward while waiting for a customer to make up his mind on a socket set. He squinted, then set his coffee down on the table. "Dale," he said, "you seeing that?" Dale looked up from the pressure washer. The shimmer had turned into a ripple, then a tear, purple and silver, splitting open the blue sky like someone had dragged a zipper straight across it. A low hum rolled over the cornfields, deep enough that people felt it in their chests before they heard it in their ears. Conversations stopped. Radios kept playing, oblivious. A woman near the middle of the sale dropped a stack of dinner plates, and the crash seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. Something came through the tear in the sky. It was massive, dark, and shaped like nothing anyone in Addison had ever built. It descended without a sound of engines, without smoke, without any of the fire and thunder people expected from movies. It simply lowered itself, slow and deliberate, into the wide hay field just off the highway, flattening a fence line and scattering a herd of very unimpressed cows. For 3 full seconds, nobody in Addison moved. Then Sheriff Bell set down his coffee, looked at the ship, looked at the crowd, and said the only thing that felt appropriate. "Well, that's gonna need a permit." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, quickly swallowed by fear as a seam split open along the side of the ship. and light spilled out onto the flattened grass. Frank looked at his booth full of rusted tools and dead electronics, then back at the ship, and felt a strange, creeping sense that this day was about to get very complicated very fast. Nobody grabbed their phones. Nobody ran, not yet. Because deep down, every person standing on that highway that morning understood one simple truth about small-town Michigan. Whatever came out of that ship, they were not about to pack up the sail and leave. Not with $300 in unsold inventory sitting right there on the table. The ramp lowered with a groan of unfamiliar metal, and the first shapes began to move inside the ship, tall, armored, and utterly unaware that they had just landed in the one place on Earth where every single person believed they already owned the best deal in the universe. The first alien to step onto Michigan soil stood nearly 8 feet tall, wrapped in dark plated armor that shimmered faintly, like oil on water. Its helmet had no visible eyes, only a curved sensor strip that swept slowly across the crowd, the tables, the tents, and the endless stretch of folding chairs and lawn ornaments. Behind it came a dozen more, moving in perfect formation, weapons raised, boots sinking slightly into the churned mud of the hay field. A device on the lead alien's chest crackled, and a mechanical voice rang out, translated into rough but understandable English. "Inhabitants of this world, we are the Threxian Combine. Resistance will be recorded and punished. Surrender your defensive installations immediately." Nobody moved. Nobody surrendered anything. Mostly because nobody understood what a defensive installation was supposed to look like at a yard sale. Frank leaned toward Dale and muttered under his breath, "What installations?" "We got a broken microwave and half a box of Christmas lights." The alien commander's sensor strip locked onto Frank's booth. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, studying the table like a man reading a menu in a foreign language. Its gaze passed over the dead television, a stack of rusted wrenches, an old CB radio with a tangled antenna, and finally landed on something that made it freeze entirely. A bright orange air horn, the kind used at football games, sitting next to a handwritten sign that said $2 or best offer. The alien picked it up carefully, turning it over in its armored fingers as if handling something dangerous. It pressed a small stud on the side, testing it the way a soldier might test the safety on a rifle. Nothing happened because the trigger required a full squeeze, not a light tap. The alien tried again, harder this time, and the horn let out a blast so loud and sudden that half the crowd flinched. 3 dogs started barking at once, and a nearby toddler burst into tears. The alien staggered backward, nearly dropping the horn, its sensor strip flashing red. Its voice crackled through the translator again, panicked this time. "Sonic weapon confirmed. All units non-lethal defensive tone detected." Dale, watching from behind his own table, could not help himself. "That's a $2 air horn," he called out. "Batteries not included." The alien did not seem to process sarcasm. It clutched the horn tighter, treating it like evidence of a hidden arsenal, and began scanning the rest of Frank's table with renewed urgency. Its attention landed next on Dale's pressure washer, sitting proud and silver beside a hand-painted sign reading "Runs great, just needs a hose." Dale, sensing an opportunity nobody in Addison would ever pass up, reached over and pulled the starter cord before anyone could stop him. The engine roared to life with a mechanical scream, and a jet of water blasted sideways across the grass with enough force to knock over a folding chair. The alien commander threw up an arm on instinct, and 2 of the soldiers behind it dropped into defensive crouches, weapons raised toward the machine as if it might charge them. The translator crackled out words that sounded almost desperate. "High-pressure liquid propulsion device. Reclassify threat level." Sheriff Bell, watching from 20 feet away, rubbed his forehead and muttered, "Lord help us. They think Dale's pressure washer is a weapon." It was at that exact moment that Frank realized something important, something that would end up changing the entire course of the day. These creatures, with their armored suits and their glowing ship and their translated threats, had absolutely no idea what anything on this table actually was. To them, every rusted tool, every dead appliance, every handwritten sign reading "best offer" looked like something dangerous, something advanced, something worth fearing. And if there was one thing Frank Holloway understood better than almost anyone standing on that highway, It was how to make a buyer believe they were looking at something far more valuable than it really was. He straightened his cap, cleared his throat, and stepped forward with the calm, practiced tone of a man who had spent 11 years talking strangers into paying too much for things they didn't need. "Careful with that," Frank said, nodding toward the pressure washer. "That thing'll take the paint clean off a tank." The alien commander's sensor strip turned fully toward him. There was no way to know if it understood the boast, but it took a slow step back anyway. Weapon lowering just slightly. Somewhere behind Frank, Dale grinned and killed the engine, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel like a warning. Word was already spreading down the highway, table to table, booth to booth, faster than any radio signal. Something had landed. Something was scared of an air horn and a pressure washer. And every vendor along the 127 corridor, upon hearing that, felt the exact same instinct rise up at once. If these things were mistaking junk for weapons, then business, strange as it sounded, had never looked better. But as more soldiers spilled out of the ship and fanned out across the field, it became clear that fear alone would not hold them back for long. And Addison's opening morning was only just getting started. By 8 in the morning, word had traveled the length of the sail faster than any siren could have carried it. Vendors abandoned their coffee to crowd near Frank's booth, phones finally coming out, though most people were too stunned to actually film anything useful. The aliens had spread into a loose perimeter around their ship, scanning tables, picking through boxes, treating an entire flea market like a minefield of unknown technology. At a booth near the old grain elevator, a woman named Carol Ann Doyle was selling ceramic lawn gnomes, wind chimes, and a collection of vintage bowling trophies. 2 Threxian soldiers approached her table with the same careful posture they'd used on Frank's pressure washer, sensor strips sweeping over a garden gnome holding a tiny fishing pole. One soldier picked up the gnome, turning it in its hands. The translator on its chest crackled. Organic effigy. Possible surveillance device or false idol used to intimidate enemy combatants. Carol Ann, who had sold gnomes at this exact spot for 6 summers running, put her hands on her hips. "That's Gerald. He's been sitting on my porch since 2019. He doesn't do surveillance, he does yard decoration." The soldier did not lower the gnome. Instead, it set it carefully back on the table, as if placing down an unstable explosive, and backed away slowly, weapon still raised. Carol Ann exchanged a look with her neighbor, an older man named Walter Higgins who sold antique clocks, and both of them started to understand the same strange truth spreading down the highway. These creatures had incredible ships, advanced armor, weapons that could probably level the whole county, and absolutely zero understanding of what any of it actually meant on the ground in rural Michigan. Near the center of the sail, the alien commander, whose translator identified him only by a string of clicking syllables, the humans quickly shortened to Commander Zeth, had gathered his officers for a hurried consultation beside the ship's ramp. Sensor readings from every table came back the same. Unknown power signatures, unidentified weapon housings, devices with unclear purpose but implied lethal capability. Zeth's second in command, a smaller soldier with a cracked visor, reported grimly. Sonic weapon confirmed at first position. High-pressure liquid weapon confirmed at second position. Unknown idol-based intimidation devices at third position. Sir, this world's civilian population appears to carry more armament per person than an entire garrison. Zeth stared out at the endless line of folding tables stretching toward the horizon in both directions. Tables he had no way of knowing continued for 127 miles. To him, it looked less like a yard sale and more like a fortified supply line stretching beyond the edge of his scanners. "This is not a settlement," Zeth said slowly. "This is a staging ground." Back near Frank's booth, Sheriff Bell had made a decision. He wasn't about to call this in as a routine disturbance, but he also wasn't about to let a bunch of nervous tourists start a panic before he understood what he was dealing with. He walked toward Zeth with both hands visible, palms open, the same posture he used when talking down an angry drunk outside the Rooster Bar on a Friday night. "Morning," Bell said, keeping his voice even. "Sheriff Marcus Bell, Hillsdale County. Seems like there's been a bit of a misunderstanding here." Zeth's translator crackled. You are the military authority of this territory. Bell considered lying, decided against it, and settled somewhere in between. I'm the authority around here, yeah. And I'll tell you straight, nobody on this road is looking for a fight. They're looking to sell you a lawn mower, maybe a nice recliner if you're in the market. Zeth's sensor strip flickered, processing. Your soldiers display casual confidence in the face of overwhelming force. This suggests either extreme discipline or weapons capability far beyond current estimates. Bell almost laughed, catching himself just in time. He glanced sideways at Frank, who gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent signal that said, "Don't correct him, let him keep thinking that." Bell turned back to Zeth with the straightest face he could manage. "Let's just say we don't scare easy around here," Bell said. "Now you strike my county, you're gonna have federal folks here inside the hour, and they don't sell lawn mowers. They bring the real hardware." It was a bluff and a thin one, but it landed exactly the way Bell hoped. Zeth's officers exchanged uneasy glances, weapons lowering by a fraction. For the first time since the ship had landed, the soldiers looked less like conquerors and more like tourists who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood and were starting to realize it. Word of the standoff spread down the corridor even faster than the news of the landing itself, and somewhere behind Frank's booth, a decision was already forming among the vendors, quiet at first. Then more determined. If these creatures were going to treat a used pressure washer like a superweapon, then Addison, Michigan was not about to correct that impression. Not yet. Because down the road, past the fireworks stand and the old grain silo, something far louder than an air horn was about to roll onto the highway, and Commander Zeth had no idea what was coming. The rumble started low, somewhere past the old grain silo, growing steadily as it rolled closer down Route 127. It sounded at first like distant thunder, until the ground itself began to vibrate, rattling loose change on folding tables and knocking over an unattended lawn chair. Commander Zeth's officers turned toward the source instantly, weapons snapping up in unison. Around the bend came Earl Kowalski's antique steam tractor, a restored monster of iron and brass that Earl had spent 15 years rebuilding, trailing thick white steam and belching black smoke from its stack pipe. Beside it rolled two more tractors, a combined harvester the size of a small house, and behind those, a line of pickup trucks with mismatched mufflers roaring like a small stampede. Every single vehicle belonged to a local farmer who had heard about the standoff over CB radio and decided the best response to an alien invasion was to show up in whatever machine made the most. Noise. The convoy rolled to a stop just short of the ship, engines idling, steam hissing, exhaust rattling window frames 3 booths away. Zeth stared at the wall of iron and smoke, sensor strip flickering rapidly, clearly recalculating every threat assessment his scanners had produced that morning. Armored vehicle column, Zeth's second-in-command reported, voice tight. Multiple units. Thermal signatures consistent with active weapon systems. Earl Kowalski climbed down from his tractor, wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag, and walked forward with the calm confidence of a man who had wrestled stubborn machinery his entire life and wasn't about to be intimidated by anything with fewer moving parts than his combine. "Sheriff," Earl called out, nodding to Bell, "figured you might need some backup." Bell allowed himself a small, tight smile. "Figured right," Zeth's translator crackled with something close to alarm. "This world's civilian population operates independent armored assets without central authorization." "That's right," Frank called out from his booth, unable to resist. "Every farmer out here's got his own tank. We just don't paint 'em green." The bluff was working better than anyone could have hoped, but it was about to be tested in a way nobody expected. From deeper in the ship, a new figure emerged down the ramp, taller than Zeth, wrapped in armor plated with additional markings that clearly denoted higher rank. This was Overlord Kesari, commander of the Threxian invasion fleet, arriving to see personally why his ground forces had stalled at the very first settlement they encountered. Kesari's sensor strip swept across the tractors, the trucks, the endless tables stretching in both directions, and finally settled on the crowd of a few hundred humans who had gathered, but refused to run. His translator carried a deeper, more resonant tone than Zeth's. "Explain this delay," Kesari demanded. One settlement should not slow an invasion fleet. Zeth straightened, choosing his words carefully. Overlord, this is not a settlement. Preliminary analysis suggests a fortified logistics corridor stretching beyond scanner range. Civilian population is armed with concealed sonic weapons, high-pressure liquid weapons, unidentified idle technology. And now independent armored vehicles. Kesari's sensor strip narrowed on Earl's steam tractor, still hissing and groaning like some kind of mechanical beast. He studied the iron wheels, the brass fittings, the thick black smoke pouring from the stack, clearly built to intimidate rather than transport. And this, Kesari said slowly, is a common civilian vehicle. Common as dirt, Earl answered without missing a beat, arms crossed. Every farm around here's got 2 or 3. It was, at that exact moment, that National Guard Colonel Jack Dawson arrived on scene. Having been scrambled from the base outside Jackson, the moment reports of an unidentified craft reached the state emergency line. Dawson stepped out of his vehicle in full uniform, radio in hand, and took in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis and never once imagined it would look like this. Steam tractors, farmers, a sheriff standing calmly beside an alien overlord, an entire highway of folding tables stretching to the horizon, untouched, unbothered, still very much open for business. Dawson approached slowly, sizing up Kesari with the same steady calm Bell had used earlier. "Colonel Jack Dawson, Michigan National Guard," he said, voice firm but even. "I'll ask you plainly. What exactly are your intentions here?" Kesari's sensor strip turned fully toward him, and for the first time since landing, something in the Overlord's posture shifted, not fear exactly, but a deep and growing uncertainty. He looked past Dawson, past the tractors, past the crowd, down the long stretch of Route 127 disappearing into the summer haze. Tables continuing endlessly in both directions, as far as any scanner could measure. "How far," Kesari asked slowly, "does this fortification extend?" Dawson didn't blink. 127 miles, he said. "Give or take." The silence that followed stretched long enough for every vendor on that stretch of highway to feel it settle over the crowd like a held breath, because nobody, not Dawson, not Bell, not even Frank himself, knew exactly how Kesari was about to respond to the idea that an entire state had apparently prepared for this exact moment. Kesari stood motionless for a long moment, sensor strip flickering as it processed the number Dawson had just given him. 127 miles. To an invasion fleet expecting scattered pockets of resistance, the idea of a single unbroken line of armed civilians stretching that far across open ground was not a comforting thought. And Kesari's officers clearly felt the same unease rippling through their ranks. Dawson pressed his advantage, keeping his voice level, almost bored, the tone of a man discussing weather rather than an interstellar standoff. "Every one of these folks," he said, gesturing toward the endless row of booths, "has been doing this a long time, longer than your fleet's probably been mapping this system. You want to test how deep that line goes, that's your call. I wouldn't recommend it." Behind him, Earl's steam tractor let out a long hiss of built-up pressure, timed by pure accident but landing with perfect effect. 2 of Kesari's soldiers flinched visibly, weapons twitching upward before lowering again under Zeth's sharp hand signal. It was at this moment that Frank decided the bluff needed one final push, the kind of closing move he'd used 100 times to seal a stubborn sale. He walked forward, past Bell, past Dawson, straight up toward Kesari himself, ignoring the way every soldier in the field tensed at his approach. "Tell you what," Frank said, reaching back toward his booth without looking, grabbing the dead television set off his table with both hands. He held it up, turning it so the cracked black screen faced Kesari directly. "This right here, this used to run something we call a satellite feed, pulled in signals from clear across the planet. Now it just sits there. But somewhere out past that field, we got a whole building full of ones that still work, watching every square mile of sky from here to the Ohio line." It wasn't remotely true. And every human standing close enough to hear it fought the urge to laugh. But Kesari's sensor strip locked onto the dead television with total focus. Clearly unable to distinguish a broken 30-year-old appliance from genuine surveillance hardware. Long-range detection network, Kesari said slowly, more to himself than to Frank. Distributed across the territory. Something like that, Frank said, setting the television back down with the calm satisfaction of a man who had just closed the deal of his life. Kesari turned to Zeth, and the two exchanged a rapid, clipped conversation in their own language, untranslated, though the tone needed no translation at all. Frustration, uncertainty. And underneath both, something that sounded very much like retreat. Finally, Kesari faced the crowd once more, his translator crackling to life. This world's civilian defense structure exceeds current invasion parameters. Continued engagement risks unacceptable losses for uncertain gain. Dawson kept his expression perfectly neutral, though beside him, Sheriff Bell allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. "Sounds like the smart call," Dawson said. Kesari's gaze swept once more across the tractors, the trucks, the tables stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The strange, dead television that had apparently convinced him more than any weapon had all morning. Then he turned back toward his ship, addressing his soldiers in a tone that needed no translation to understand as an order to withdraw. The Threxian troops began falling back in loose, hurried formation, nothing like the crisp lines they'd marched out in that morning. Zeth lingered a moment longer near Frank's booth, sensor strip fixed on the little orange air horn still sitting on the table. "This device," Zeth said through his translator. "It could be purchased." Frank glanced at Dale, who shrugged, then back at Zeth. $2, Frank said. "Best offer stands." There was a pause, and then, in a motion nobody quite expected, Zeth reached into a compartment on his armor and produced a small, glowing object. Setting it on the table in exchange, before scooping up the horn and turning to follow his retreating soldiers up the ramp. The ship's engines began to hum, the same low vibration that had first announced its arrival, now signaling its departure. Within minutes, the massive ship lifted off the flattened hay field, rising slow and silent before the tier in the sky sealed shut behind it, leaving nothing behind but scorched grass. A very confused herd of cows, and several hundred stunned bargain hunters standing along Route 127. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, from somewhere near the back of the crowd, a woman's voice called out the only question that truly mattered to a town like Addison. "Does this mean the sale's still on?" Sheriff Bell looked at Dawson. Dawson looked at Frank. Frank looked down at the strange, glowing object sitting on his table where the air horn used to be, then back up at the crowd, and allowed himself, for the first time all morning, a genuine smile. "Sale's still on," Frank announced, loud enough for half the highway to hear. "Everything must go." By noon, the 127 corridor sale had returned to something resembling normal. If normal could ever apply again to a town that had just talked down an alien invasion using a pressure washer, a dead television, and a steam tractor from 1948. Trucks kept rolling in from Ohio and Indiana, most of the new arrivals completely unaware of what had happened only a few hours earlier, still hunting for bargains. Still haggling over dollar signs written in Sharpie. Frank Holloway kept the strange, glowing object Zeth had left behind sitting on the corner of his booth for the rest of the day, refusing every offer to buy it. Though offers came fast once word spread. He eventually handed it over to Colonel Dawson, who promised it would end up somewhere far more secure than a folding table on Route 127. Though nobody in Addison really believed the government would tell them what it turned out to be. Sheriff Bell spent the rest of the afternoon fielding calls from state police, county officials, and at least 2 reporters from Lansing, all asking the same basic question in a dozen different ways. What exactly happened out there? Bell gave them all the same simple answer. A misunderstanding, resolved peacefully, no injuries, situation handled by local response. He left out the part about Earl's tractor and Frank's television, mostly because he suspected nobody outside Hillsdale County would believe it anyway, and honestly, he wasn't sure he blamed them. Dale Whitfield sold the pressure washer by 4 o'clock that afternoon. To a man from Fort Wayne who had absolutely no idea it had spent the morning convincing an alien overlord that Michigan farmers carried personal weapons of mass destruction. Dale considered telling him the truth, then decided some stories were better left as local legend. Carol Ann Doyle's garden gnome, the one identified as a possible false idol, sold within the hour to a young couple from Fort Recovery who thought he was charming. With absolutely no clue how close he'd come to being classified as a surveillance threat by an alien invasion fleet. Carol Ann kept the story to herself for weeks, though eventually it slipped out over coffee at the diner, and from there it spread through Hillsdale County the way every good story eventually does. Colonel Dawson filed his official report that evening, describing the event in careful, measured language meant for state and federal review. Though even he admitted privately to Sheriff Bell that no report could really capture what it felt like standing between an alien overlord and a line of steam tractors, waiting to see who would blink first. Weeks later, when the story finally reached wider attention, most people outside Michigan assumed it was some kind of viral hoax, a small town spinning tall tales the way small towns sometimes do. But everyone in Addison knew better. They had stood on that highway, they had seen the ship. They had watched Frank Halloway hold up a broken television and talk an alien commander into believing Earth had a surveillance network spanning the entire state. The following summer, when the 127 corridor sale opened again, Frank set up his booth in the exact same spot, same folding table, same hand-painted sign reading best offer. Beside his usual pile of rusted tools and dead appliances, he added one new item, a small hand-lettered placard that read in simple block letters, "Alien tested, alien approved." It became, without question, the most photographed booth on the entire highway that year, and Frank never once had to explain the joke to anyone from Hillsdale County. Sheriff Bell still walks the sale every August, same faded Detroit Tigers cap, same cup of coffee. Though these days people stop him more often to ask about the invasion than to ask about fishing reels. He always tells the story the same simple way. Aliens landed looking for weapons. They found a yard sale instead. And somewhere out among the stars, an entire invasion fleet is now convinced that the deadliest fighting force in the galaxy is a retired farmer with a $2 air horn and absolutely no intention of lowering his price. If this story gave you a reason to smile today, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and drop a comment letting me know which line made you laugh the hardest. Share this video with someone who would appreciate a good old-fashioned Michigan yard sale standing up to an alien invasion fleet. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.